Hey there, everyone. It's Cassandra from CassandraTyndall.com here, and today we are going to be discussing Saturn stationing retrograde. So I didn't actually think I would do a video about this subject. It's not generally something I put a lot of emphasis on personally when I'm looking at transits and the moving sky, though I have had a few people ask me about it. So I thought I would just sort of touch on a few main points around Saturn and Saturn's retrograde and what that might mean for you. So it was December 2020 where Saturn moved into Aquarius after a brief preview period that we had in March, April, May, and June of 2020. So at the end of that year, Saturn moved back into Aquarius, where it's just been sort of barreling along, doing its thing. And it was at the very end of April, so around April 29, Saturn hit 13 degrees of Aquarius, so about halfway through the sign. And it's not going to leave that 13-degree mark until June 17. So Saturn is pretty much smack bang in the middle of a fixed sign and for a long period of time, nearly 6.5 to 7 weeks. So if you have a planet or a point, and when I say a point, I mean ascending, say your ascendant or your midheaven, at around, let's say, 11 to 14, 15 degrees of a fixed sign, you're kind of getting hit by this Saturn retrograde. And then I realized, oh, yeah, that's my chart. And I thought, oh, well, this is definitely something to perhaps discuss because, some of, what's been happening with me may also be helpful for you too. Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about Saturn. Saturn is so many things, and I certainly can't cover it all in a quick YouTube video. Maybe I'll do a deep dive on Saturn at some other point. But Saturn in Aquarius is the cold, icy winds of Aquarius. It was when Saturn first moved into Aquarius last year, the term social isolation became a thing. Saturn does mean lots of things in astrology. It is the furthest planet that we can see with the naked eye. And so for thousands of years, Saturn was the demarcator between the known universe and the unknown universe. So in fact, it was a really spiritual planet. And that's something that we don't really hear a lot about Saturn now. We might, a lot of the things that we sort of associate with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto was kind of Saturn's job. So when I talk about Saturn and the idea of it being a spiritual planet, it is the sort of spirituality that arrives or comes from being isolated or being contemplative or alone. Like the hermit in the tarot deck, it's that person that goes into their cave and they contemplate and they think about things. So it can bring a sort of a spiritual journey that comes through that sort of fecund, mystical, imaginative, and creative space that comes from being alone. Saturn is the most superior of our planets from the Earth's, naked eye perspective. So it's very much linked to longer term cycles and longer term outcomes. So Saturn only comes into Aquarius every sort of 29 to 30 years. So there are some linkages to what we're experiencing now collectively as to what was happening sort of in the very early 90s, early to mid 90s. I often think about Saturn in Aquarius as my high school years, because the majority of that transit I was in high school. But maybe I'll touch on that part in a moment. So some of the key words or concepts listed with Saturn. So it's the furthest planet out. So there is that sort of isolated, hermit-like, loner vibration there with Saturn. It is the planet that actually has rings around it. So it can also describe concepts and ideas around containment or restriction or limitation as well. Saturn isn't the law in of itself. I think that's a little bit more Jupiter, But Saturn is the structure of the law, or the demarcator of that law or the boundary. Like you broke the law, or you broke a rule, or you crossed a boundary or a limit in some way. So it is that sort of sense of, yes or no with Jupiter. With Saturn. You've either made the grade, or you've passed the test, or you've done the thing. It's that sort of negating quality of Saturn, whether you either good enough, or or you're not. It's very distinct or discerning, I guess, if you like. Saturn is very austere and sobering. It's a very sort of serious energy. It's generally not considered, the life of the party, or spontaneous, or wanting to, try anything new or different. It is a little bit kind of maybe stuck a little bit in terms of what is known, or what is true, or what is familiar. So there is this kind of, Saturn is also linked to what we're going to be responsible for. It is serious and obliging and follows the rules. So Saturn will speak of our responsibilities, our obligations, and our duties, and whether we live up to those or not. It's a very kind of sort of harsh, it's the extreme of cold and the extreme of dry. So Saturn has a very unforgiving influence to it as well. So when it's losing my words, Mercury is squaring Neptune, applying to square Neptune. So when Saturn is in its own sign, it has no inhibition on what it can achieve and what it can do. So it's sort of said to be strong. So it can bring out the qualities of Saturn more freely or more easily. Like a veteran, I think of the old sort of army veteran, that sort of tarnished or hardened by that wisdom of experience. So Saturn's job is to sort of kind of refine or perfect or discern and make sort of things better. And in Aquarius, we're thinking about what sort of social structures or social containers or social ideals are needing refinement or needing change or needing to be sort of improved on, like rewriting the rule book in a way. Saturn is sort of that planet of limitation and boundaries. And in some circumstances and in some situations, that can provide a safety net or a container that can help you feel more safe and secure and comfortable. And then in other situations, it can also be extremely limiting. So one person's, palace, for instance, might be another person's fortress. And so boundaries can really help us as well. I think about this with my son, who's almost 7. Particularly when he was younger, if I gave him too many choices about the breakfast options, it was confusion, it was overwhelm, it wasn't going to happen. And it was like, well, you can either have this or you can have this. What's your choice? So helping to limit options, but empowering the idea of choice is really important with Saturn as well. So when we are in Saturn's sign, which we are again, we're obviously in a different sort of sign. We're more talking about, in Aquarius, more about ideals and principles and how things should be. And when Saturn slows down, it's at this 13-degree mark for, 7 weeks, which is a long time. And so since Saturn moved into Aquarius back in late 2020, Saturn's been able to, these are the rules and these are the guidelines, these are the limits and these are the containers. And we've really seen that so much, of course, with COVID-related stuff. And then sort of the pushback. So back in February, we had Saturn hit up and make a square with Uranus and Taurus. And, that's a little bit of something that I might talk about in another video, but, the idea of change, and we are in so much change globally, but the tension between how much to change and how much needs to stay the same. And not everybody agrees on, what that should or could be, or how it could or should look like. But on the personal level, we're looking to our charts. What is Aquarius in our birth chart? Do we have any planets or points at 13? And how can we look at this station retrograde and the retrograde of Saturn, which will continue until October the 11th. And then Saturn will station direct at 6 degrees of Aquarius. So it'll be going from 13 backwards through the zodiac to 6 degrees. So anywhere between sort of the 13 to 6 degrees of the fixed signs are going to form that sort of either square or opposition aspect. So what we can anticipate with Saturn and Aquarius is maybe some, and we've seen this already, right? We've seen this with the renegotiation of the boundaries and the limits in regards to, I think, parts of the UK are opening up in ways they haven't done in a long time. I was speaking to someone from New York just the other day, and they're like, yeah, it's business as usual. So it's almost like Saturn stationing and starting to head in a different direction is highlighting that there's a different direction around boundaries, limits, and the rules as well. And that sort of, those wheels are being greased a little bit with Jupiter and Pisces too. But on that personal level, coming back to that personal level, it might also be a bit of an alleviation to some of that heaviness, or the responsibilities that you have, or the obligations that you need to meet. So personally, since Saturn moved into Aquarius in December, I have not stopped writing. I have been teaching online, but which I love. I love doing all those things. I've been exceptionally busy, but I sort of didn't really realize just how under the pump I was until Saturn really started to slow down. And funnily enough, it was only this week where much of the work that I had deadlines attached to it. It had levels of criteria. There were certain things I had to certain standards I had to meet with these different writing projects that I had on. And it's only now I've started to be able to sort of catch my breath, and slightly, just a little bit. And so, this 13 Aquarius is actually trining and squaring, obviously trining my air planets and squaring my fixed planets. And it was that sort of realization that I'm like, oh my God, I'm actually not under the pump anymore. I've got a pace that's a little bit more, maybe slightly more flexible, if I dare say that word, but there's still so many projects and things in the pipeline, but there's not a firm deadline attached to it. I don't have anybody over my head with these particular projects because they're coming, from myself. So it's not like I've got, anybody else telling me, Cass, these horoscopes are due now, or blah, blah. So there is a certain level of freedom, I guess, for want of a better word. And that's going to be a big theme for June when Saturn does hit up against Uranus again. It's already within range. 13 degrees is the degree where Saturn and Uranus do form their square again. So we are in the thick of it, but it's technically speaking more about next month. So for you, what might this be? And I like to look at, obviously, the heaviness or the responsibilities or the obligations of Saturn now do have the opportunity to be turned around. But I also like to, when working with retrogrades in the moving sky, is I do really like to take the Vedic perspective of the retrograde planets. So when planets do undergo retrograde phases, their orbit is closer to Earth. So technically they are closer to us. And so when you see them in the night sky, which will be the case with Saturn over the coming months, is you'll be able to see it more bright, or it's not a bright star, but you'll see it more brightly than usual. And when a star or anything in our life is closer to us, it invites us to pay more attention. I used this analogy the other day when I was talking, can't remember who to, whether it was to a client or students or what have you, but when you go to work each and every day, I'm assuming that you're not working at home anymore, but just when everything's normal and you go to work, take your car, go where you go, and you just autopilot it. And sometimes you can get to the other end of the journey, go, how did I even get there? That's when planets are just operating as they should, right? But if you've got a friend or family member or what have you staying overnight and they've got to follow you in their car to work, and then they can, make their way around town. I mean, I've done that so many times when I've traveled. You will drive differently. Okay. So when you've got somebody following you, you're just not going to dart in and out of lanes willy-nilly. You're not going to indicate, put your blinker on, or not put your blinker on and not change lanes. You're going to pay more attention. You're going to check your rear view mirror more. You're not going to drive as fast because that person is following you. They're closer to you. They've grabbed your attention. And this is the thing with the planets. In Vedic astrology, they're called grahas or grabbers. So when a planet slows down, not only is it closer to us, it grabs our attention. So as Saturn stations retrograde in Aquarius, so let's just talk about the Saturn itself. It might mean I need to slow down, change direction around, and rethink and recalibrate and reprioritize and reassess my responsibilities. What am I going to be responsible for and what am I not? What obligations am I willing to continue to uphold and what am I not? Okay, what limits are just really like pissing me off and I don't want to have these limits anymore? But which limits do I also understand are doing me some good? Okay, so things might be, they will probably slow down a little bit as the retrograde happens. But sometimes, that can be that blessing in disguise. As it is for me, it's giving me some wiggle room to work on some of my own personal projects in my business. So I'm really looking forward to that, and stay tuned. Lots more teaching to come, but it does give us that opportunity just to put those cosmic brakes on and figure out what do we really want to make substantial? What do we really want to put effort into, and in order to see those results over time? Now, Saturn in Aquarius is a really interesting dynamic because it really is highlighting polarization, and the polarization of ideals. Saturn is not often linked to what's popular. We might see Venus as a little bit more of a planet of popularity. And in horary astrology, we often look to the moon for that. But Saturn sort of does have a little bit of a undertone of popularity in the sense of the status quo is sort of like the popular, the popular club or the popular philosophy or the popular way of things. To be not that person is almost to be more of a heretic in nature. And that's not, even though it has a religious connotation, but traditionally a heretic just meant that you were not of the predominated school of thought. Okay, so it didn't necessarily have religious connotation to it, although it sort of does more now. So it didn't mean that you were anti anything, you just weren't going against that familiar grain. And so with this particular transit, Saturn coming back, squaring Uranus again, on the personal level, it might also be about what narratives am I willing to buy into or continue buying into, and which ones are just really not ones I feel like I need to adhere to anymore. So this might be about personal boundaries. This might be about saying no, especially as people move into the workplace again. Like a lot of people are now returning to the office. It's almost like returning to the office, but with a different set of rules. So that might be something that comes up for you as well. So the retrograde can, definitely be that reversal or the let up. Over this Saturn cycle, it will be retrograde and through until about October. And Saturn generally will spend about a third of its entire transit in retrograde, or going retrograde, I should say. And so it basically sort of symbolizes we need to be spending about a third of our life reassessing our priorities, what's really important, and what's not. Otherwise, we're just, fluffing around and not really doing anything of substance or meaning as well. So Saturn in Aquarius might also highlight for some people philosophies, schools of thought, ideas, idealisms that may be against the grain or may not any longer suit you. And so I think about the last time that Saturn went into Aquarius, and as I mentioned, it was predominantly my high school years. And so I think it was 1991 when the internet, sort of the World Wide Web and the whole idea of the internet really came about. Remember, it used to be called the information superhighway. And so now we're in the Saturn return of the internet, and the way we share information, the way that we exchange ideas with each other has forever changed. And we often get, whether it's subliminal with the algorithms, whether it's subliminal, but we get a lot of ideas thrown at us, and we form opinions, we form ideas, and we sort of maybe get into, it's the way social media is, we get into these like bubbles or algorithms of similar lines of thinking and similar lines of almost like false dichotomies or false realities or false bubbles. And so as Saturn goes retrograde, you might want to embrace some of the more maybe righteous components of Saturn, and that is the isolation and the contemplation and sort of going within a little bit and working out for yourself as an individual what schools of thought work for me, what clubs or groups or things work for me. It may not necessarily what you're told is, what works for you. Okay. It's just on that sort of more collective level, being left or being right or being this, it's just so polarizing and divisive. And sometimes the more that we're on these platforms and things like that, we sometimes almost lose sight of what is right for our own souls and our own spirit. So getting off the grid a little bit, and going into that place of imposed isolation or of choice, and contemplating and thinking about things, and deriving from that sort of nothingness can come that sort of divine inspiration or those divine ideas of how you want to move forward with this transit. And maybe sort of stepping away from winds of change that are rising on a popular tide, if you like. I can't ever think about Saturn in Aquarius without, being an angsty teenager. And this was obviously my Saturn opposition. I'm a Saturn and Leo native. And obviously the grunge movement was huge. Black metal in Scandinavia. And I remember when I was in high school, I went to an all-girls Catholic school, and this was the time when New Kids on the Block were huge. Now, if you don't know them, if you're a younger person, just Google that, because I can't tell you about them. But I just remember the girls being like, oh, I love Donnie, and I think there was Joey, and I can't remember the others. And then they'd be like, who do you like, Cass? And I'd be like, Metallica. And so I was sort of this like rebel outsider, especially in, Catholic girls' school, rocking up to school dances, wearing pretty ugly t-shirts that I adored. And it was interesting, because I was sort of this outsider. And then a couple of years, into our high school years, and obviously hormones and boys and things like that, and the explosion of grunge in particular, and I think bands like Slayer, which I still love, and some Sepultura, obviously from Brazil, and then there was Bertram and different bands, Opeth from Sweden, and I could go on and on, but anyway, it's not a musical show. But when the explosion of these kind of grunge movement, black metal movements, etc., and all the girls who liked New Kids on the Block were like, Cass, can you record a cassette for us? And so, go home and, record the cassette. They weren't interested in the music, but they were interested in the boys who liked the music. And so it's the idea of sort of bandwagon and what's popular and those kind of things. And so as Saturn retrogrades, it might be that invitation to be like, where have I bought into ideas or concepts that are not really my own? And where do I need to break free of some of those? Or whether you want to break into something new, or if you found that you followed something new that isn't really aligned with you. So just a tidbit from the past, but I do sort of really recognize that as Saturn as being something that's popular, something that was outcast or unpopular or niche, then sort of becomes mainstream in some way. I think it was even Kurt Cobain who said, everyone tries so hard to be different, but they all end up looking the same. And we see that now even more and more and more with the internet. So that's my little Saturn story for you, Saturn in Aquarius through those high school years. But it's this weekend, May 22, 23 here in Australia, where Saturn will actually station retrograde 13 degrees, and it will stay there until mid-June, about June 17. And the retrograde will continue through until about October 11. So do take a little bit of time, particularly on Saturday, which is Saturn's day, to maybe, just sort of get truer to what your priorities are, what's really important for you, and where you are willing to undergo a little bit of effort, a little bit of toil, a little bit of, old-fashioned elbow grease in order to get those results or get those longer-term outcomes that Saturn always promises. But stepping back and stepping away, and also understanding or getting more of a realization within yourself of doing what's really true for you. This is next month in particular, as I said, with the Saturn Uranus square. This is sort of, unleashing your own inner rebel. Where have you been following the rules and you need to be breaking them? Maybe where are you following the rules, but realizing they're not for you anyway? So all the things, and those are some things that maybe you can meditate on, which is a very Saturn thing to do, and contemplate on as Saturn grinds to a halt. So we've still got a few weeks of Saturn at 13 degrees, so we are not out of that sort of tense period right now. So I hope you found that useful, something to reflect on in your own life and in your own chart, and also in your studies of astrology and of Saturn. So anyway, until next time, I hope you have a really great Saturn station, and I'll see you then.